Imagine, for a moment, a tiny, incredibly fragile human life, maybe born far, far too early, struggling, facing just immense odds. What if, instead of the usual incubator environment, we could place that life back into something that feels, well, almost like a womb, warm, liquid, supportive? What if we could artificially recreate that? Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into something that, honestly, it still sounds a bit like science fiction, artificial uterus technology. But looking at the material you brought together, it's clear this isn't just a concept anymore. It's moving fast. So our mission today is to really get into these sources, the research papers, the analyses, and figure out what's really going on. We want to explore where things stand right now, the amazing progress being made, its potential uses, which are frankly transformative, and of course the big hurdles, technical, ethical, social, all of it.
Yeah, and it's quite a mix of sources we're looking at, isn't it? We've got the really technical stuff describing the systems themselves. Then there are specific studies on these groundbreaking animal experiments, plus pieces looking at how society might change because of this, and yes, a pretty frank look at the really tough ethical and legal questions it brings up. So fundamentally, the technology we're discussing, sometimes called ex utero fetal development or extend, it's basically trying to copy the biological womb as closely as possible just outside the body. Think about the core structure, like those BioBag ideas you see in the diagrams. It's sort of a specialized bag or container filled with this carefully formulated liquid meant to act like amniotic fluid. The fetus is suspended in there, protected, able to move naturally. But the really tricky part, the core life support, is managing gas exchange, getting oxygen in, CO2 out without working lungs. So the current approach involves very carefully connecting the fetal umbilical cord vessels to an external oxygenation machine, basically an artificial placenta. That lets the blood circulate outside the body just enough to handle the gas exchange.
Okay, hold on. Recreating a placenta. That sounds unbelievably complex. So where is this tech right now? Like, practically speaking, in the labs. What have they actually done?
That really is the key question, isn't it? And the progress, especially using animal models, it's been pretty striking over, say, the last decade or so. A really big moment, was that work by Alan Flake and his team at CHOP Children's Hospital of Philadelphia back in 2017.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember hearing about that. The sheep, right? The lamb fetuses.
Exactly. They use lamb fetuses. And physiologically, they're quite similar to human fetuses around that very critical premature stage, like 24 weeks gestation. And they actually managed to keep these lambs going for about 4 weeks inside that BioBag system.
4 weeks. That's huge. What did that first study really show?
Well, the crucial thing was they confirmed stable physiological development over that time, normal growth, organ function, that sort of thing. And what that immediately suggested was, wow, this could potentially be a real game changer for those extremely premature human babies, the ones born before 24 weeks who struggle so much with current incubators because their lungs just aren't ready. It showed there might be another way, a way that kind of bypasses the lungs for a while. And building on that work, just recently in 2024, that same CHOP group, now working with Duke University, they published another study, this time looking specifically at brain development in their Extend system.
Ah, brain development. That seems incredibly vital and maybe even more complex. What did they find there?
So they supported extremely premature fetuses again using a similar setup, and then they did this really detailed analysis of the brain tissue, looking at gene expression. And what was pretty remarkable was that the brain development patterns they saw in the artificial uterus system looked very similarly to what you'd see in normal late preterm infants, which is, a really important piece of the puzzle when you think about the quality of development these systems might support long term.
And it's not just this one group in Philadelphia pushing things forward, is it? I feel like the sources mentioned work going on elsewhere, too.
Oh, absolutely not. It's definitely a global effort. We see studies coming out of Japan, for instance, work by Watabe and colleagues at Tokyo Medical and Dental University between 2019 and 2021.
And they use different animals, I think. Goats.
That's right, goats. They use goat fetuses and managed to keep them going for about 5 days, 120 hours in artificial amniotic fluid. And they reported really high survival rates, something like 87.5%, and growth rates that look pretty comparable to normal in utero development for that time frame. But beyond that, the sources definitely point to ongoing research at places like Tohoku University, also in Japan. There are groups involved in the European Perinatal Life Support Project. The University of Michigan is working on artificial placenta models, and teams in Spain and Singapore are doing work with sheep and also piglets.
Wow, so it's sheep, goats, pigs, Even mentions of cows and monkeys in some contexts. It's like a whole research menagerie.
Precisely. And that diversity is good, right? It shows people are trying different approaches, different models, really pushing the boundaries from multiple angles. What's clear is the rapid pace of progress. We now have multiple examples showing successful support for several weeks in these animal models, and you can see the conversation is starting to shift within perinatal centers. They're beginning to think about what protocols might be needed. The aim, quite clearly, is eventual human clinical trials, at least for very specific critical situations.
Okay, so moving beyond the, frankly, mind-blowing science in these animal studies, what does this actually mean for people, for the real world? Where could we realistically see artificial uterus technology being used down the line?
Well, the potential uses are pretty significant, and they cover quite a range based on what the sources are discussing. I think the most immediate and probably the most compelling use is for treating extremely premature infants. We're talking about babies born incredibly early, sometimes under 500 grams, or before that 24-week viability threshold. Current methods, ventilators, incubators, they're amazing feats of engineering, but they really struggle with babies that premature. Their lungs, their skin, everything is just so underdeveloped. An artificial uterus offers this possibility of essentially putting them back into a womb-like state. It could potentially reduce really severe lung complications, cut down infection risk, improve survival rates, and hopefully lead to better long-term outcomes. One of the sources, Simon Stein et al., puts it very directly. They say this tech is needed to save the lives of low birth weight infants, and it's really seen as a leading hope for improving the odds for the most premature babies.
That absolutely feels like a clear, urgent medical need. What about other potential areas?
Another major area is infertility treatment and what's called assisted reproductive technology, or RT. Think about women who have uterine factor infertility, meaning they don't have a uterus, maybe due to surgery or a congenital condition, or it just doesn't function properly. Right now, their options are really limited. Often it's surrogacy or maybe a uterine transplant. Both come with, really high costs, significant medical risks for everyone involved, and a whole host of ethical complexities. So a future artificial uterus could, theoretically, allow an embryo created via IVF to be implanted and develop entirely outside a human body. This would offer a completely new path for those individuals or couples to have a child that's genetically related to them. Takashima et al., another source, specifically suggest it could avoid many risks associated with uterine transplant and surrogate pregnancy. A key advantage being keeping that genetic connection without needing a gestational carrier or donor uterus.
That really would shift the whole landscape of family-building options.
Absolutely. And then there's its potential as a tool for basic science, for embryology and research. It's not just about bringing a baby to term. An artificial uterus could be an incredibly powerful platform for observing fetal development over much longer periods than we currently can with just embryo culture. You could potentially study organ development, maybe even intervene in controlled ways for research purposes. Simon Stein et al. Note its potential here, calling it a possible vessel for observing and intervening on the fetus. Think about combining that capability with the brain development studies we mentioned, or stem cell research, maybe even gene editing technologies. The potential for fundamental biological discoveries is huge.
Okay, but this brings up something else, something a few sources touched on.
Yeah.
If you separate gestation entirely from the female body, what does that do to gender roles, to society itself? That feels like a potentially massive shift.
It really does, and the sources definitely lean into that possibility. The idea is that it could fundamentally change the whole experience, the choice surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, which could, in turn, potentially alter traditional gender roles, family structures, the works. One perspective quoted, I think, from Wired magazine, suggested it could essentially zero out various problems related to human pregnancy and maybe even transform the very idea of society. Hey, Toya, back in 2019, made the point that if pregnancy and birth could happen safely outside the body, maybe it becomes preferable to the risks involved with human surrogacy. And that could then impact women's career paths, maybe contribute towards greater gender equality in some ways. There's also some discussion about how this technology might intersect with broader societal issues, like concerns about low birth rates in certain countries and population policy.
Wow. Okay, so the potential applications really run the gamut, from saving the most fragile lives to possibly reshaping, fundamental aspects of human experience. But as you mentioned right at the start, this isn't easy tech. It's not here yet. Where do the sources say the biggest roadblocks are? What are the major challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. For all the promise, the sources are crystal clear. The hurdles are enormous, and they fall into these big categories: technical, ethical, and then the social and legal stuff.
Yeah.
Let's start with the technical side because just physically replicating the womb, it's extraordinarily demanding.
I can only imagine. What are some of the key technical barriers they're still facing?
Well, if you look back at the history of artificial placenta research, they ran into major problems. Things like the breakdown of fetal cardiac hemodynamics, basically, the stress on the fetal heart from pumping blood through an artificial system. The sources also mention the constant infection risk, which is huge when you're talking about maintaining a connection to the outside world for weeks or months. Even technically tricky things like spasm during umbilical vessel cannulation, just getting the connection set up without problems is hard. For a full artificial uterus, you need all that, plus precise, continuous control over temperature, oxygen levels, nutrient delivery, all tailored to a growing fetus over potentially many months. Keeping the whole environment sterile long-term is a massive challenge. And managing the complex hormonal signals needed for proper development. That's another huge one. There are just so many functions that need to work perfectly together for a long time. And honestly, there are probably unknown risks we haven't even identified yet because it's so new. So while labs have managed weeks in animals, getting to the months required for human clinical use, that's still technically a very long road.
So the sheer engineering and biological complexity is immense. Okay. And you mentioned the ethical challenges. Just the idea of growing a fetus outside a body must open up a whole new can of worms, ethically speaking.
It absolutely does. And the sources really dig into this. We're suddenly facing questions our existing ethical frameworks just weren't built to handle. Like, who is the mother of a child born from an artificial uterus? It sounds simple, but it gets complex fast when you separate genetic contribution from gestation. How do you even assess the well-being, the physical and mental development of a fetus inside this machine for months on end? What are the benchmarks? The sources grapple with that potential disconnect between genetic parents and, well, whatever the social parenting structure might be. Toya, that 2019 source, again, raises a really provocative point. What if gene manipulation becomes easier or more tempting during this ex utero process? That could, as they put it, completely change ideas about biological connection. It forces us to fundamentally re-examine things like the definition of life, viability, and certainly the legal and moral status of the human embryo and fetus when it's developing entirely outside a biological womb.
That's profound. It really does push us to rethink some very basic definitions. And what about the legal and social side? You mentioned our laws are all based on biological pregnancy.
Exactly. And that's another huge hurdle. Our current legal systems, medical law, criminal law, civil law, they simply don't have categories or provisions for pregnancy and birth happening outside a woman's body. Take civil law, for example. Often, legal protections for a fetus are tied to it being in utero. A fetus developing in an artificial uterus might literally fall into a legal gray area or even a complete void. The whole legal status of a child born this way, how do you handle birth registration, who are the legal parents, custody issues, it's all completely uncharted territory.
Yeah.
We'd essentially need to create entirely new legal frameworks. And beyond the law, there's the whole societal piece. There needs to be a massive public conversation. Will this kind of birth ever be socially accepted? Who gets access? Should it be covered by public health insurance? How does it interact with existing laws like, say, abortion regulations, especially around viability and the status of the fetus outside the body? The sources fully expect significant opposition based on ethical and religious viewpoints. Achieving any kind of broad social acceptance will likely require a very long, very careful process of discussion and consensus building.
So putting it all together, where does this leave us? It really feels like we're perched right on the edge of something potentially world-altering, but wow, there's just this mountain of unanswered questions, scientific, ethical, societal.
That sums it up pretty well, I think. The current situation is one of incredibly fast progress, but still very much in the research and experimental phase, mostly with animal models. The studies, especially with sheep and goats, they've clearly shown it's possible to support fetuses for multiple weeks. They show stable development, suggesting real potential benefits for survival and health, particularly for those extreme prematurity cases. And this is a huge but, actually using this in human clinical settings for any reason. That's going to require so much more technical validation. We need proof of safety and effectiveness over much longer periods. And as we've been saying, that technical work can't happen in a vacuum. It absolutely has to go hand in hand with equally deep ethical consideration and the development of clear guidelines. Because it's just so unprecedented, right? We urgently need to start building the legal frameworks and figuring out the social integration alongside the science. The legal status of a child born this way is right now basically a blank page. So looking ahead, what's needed? Definitely larger scale animal trials, probably continuous support for longer durations, maybe using models even closer to humans, like monkeys if possible. And absolutely in parallel, we need robust ethical committees and legal processes hashing out guidelines before any human trials are even on the table. The consensus from the sources seems to be that any implementation should proceed very, very cautiously, probably starting with those clear, urgent medical needs like saving extremely premature babies where the potential benefit is just so high.
But the whole endeavor, really, it demands this incredibly broad discussion, not just scientists and doctors talking to each other. It needs ethicists, lawyers, policymakers, the public, everyone grappling with how this might shift our basic views on life, on connection, and the new social norms that would inevitably have to emerge.
It's quite a journey we've taken, isn't it? From thinking about the engineering of these liquid-filled bags keeping tiny lambs alive, all the way to wrestling with fundamental questions about the definition of life and who legally gets custody of a child born outside a human body.
Yeah, this deep dive really drives home that artificial uterus technology. It isn't just another medical tool. It cuts right to the core of how we define life, family, maybe even what it means to be human in some really profound ways. It's technology with just breathtaking potential to save lives, to expand choices. But it absolutely forces us, as a society, to confront some of our deepest beliefs, ethical and social, head-on, long before it's actually a widespread reality. So, reflecting on all of this discussion, what's the one thing that really stands out to you, the lingering thought?
Maybe consider this. If gestation, the entire 9 months, can be completely separated from the human body, does that fundamentally change how we understand biological connection and maybe even parenthood itself in the future?
That is certainly a lot to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of artificial uteri.